Hi, I'm Obi.
I'm Hobbes.
And we're going to talk about some survival skills, specifically shelter building. Before we do though, we need to get into survival mode. So when practicing survival skills, a couple things I like to make sure to do. Again, have a good pair of nice sturdy gloves to kind of help you. For this particular activity, for shelter building, we're going to be picking up a lot of sticks and stuff like this. So this is just going to protect our hands from any scrapes, scratches, things like that. So what we're going to do for shelter building, before we even get to the idea of shelter building, when we talk about survival skills, we want to remember a rule of three. Rule of three is you can only survive in the wilderness 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. So in this particular scenario, if we're wanting to build a shelter, right, we essentially can survive 3 hours, right, before we potentially could contract like hypothermia or heat stroke or something like that. So building a shelter should be one of the first things you do when in a survival situation or in a situation where you know you need help. So when you're talking about wanting to build a shelter, I'm going to let Hobbes explain.
So when you're looking for the perfect site, you want to consider the 4 W's. So those are water, wind, widowmakers, and wildlife. So for water, you want to make sure, like where we are now, water's going to be flowing downhill. You don't want the entrance to your survival area, your shelter, to be facing uphill or where the water's going to flow into your shelter. Or you can consider wildlife. What wildlife is there? Are there ant holes where you are digging or where you're making your shelter? Are there larger animals nearby? Should you put your food somewhere else? The next thing to consider is wind. You want to make sure you are building your shelter so it blocks you from the wind, again like Obi mentioned, so we don't get that hypothermia and we stay nice and warm during the day. The last one we want to consider is widowmakers, and those are any dead trees or things that might fall on us. So we want to make sure we're building on nice, steady, sturdy trees, and there aren't any things that if it gets windy are going to fall on us. So those are the 4 W's that we need to consider when finding a site.
Cool. So Hobbes and I already kind of picked out a tree. So we've got a nice, beautiful tree right here, right? In terms of like wanting to build our shelter, things that we want to consider is making sure that, yeah, if water is coming downhill, we're not putting the entrance to our shelter right here, so water is just coming right into it. So what we're actually going to do, Hobbes and I decided we like the extra like shade and shelter that this tree is giving us on this side. And what that'll also do, this big tree is going to help protect us from a lot of those weather inclements that Hobbes was mentioning before, that water and that wind and things like that. So this right here, this couldn't be a more perfect tree. We're going to actually use this for what we're going to call our ridge pole. Our ridge pole acts like the big support of our structure or our shelter, and we're going to anchor it with this tree. So we're going to move this guy and swing it around this direction. Maybe off this side?
Yeah.
Here. So you want to kind of check, make sure it's nice and sturdy. We might swing it a bit more this way just to kind of. It's important to have your shelter right the first time, because if it's right the first time, you don't have to be making it again. So we've got our ridge pole. Now we want to clean this area up, make it a little bit more comfortable for us. we're going to be spending a lot of time in this shelter if we're out lost. So we want to make sure it's comfortable and we're going to be sleeping in it. So all this roughage, stuff like that, we're going to get rid of these guys. Any hard pine cones, big sticks, things like that. All right. Next is we want to add a little bit of a layer of insulation underneath our shelter. So how do you add extra insulation? Well, there's a lot of insulation actually right under our feet. All this right here, all this roughage is going to provide a protective barrier between us and the ground. So we're gonna collect all this roughage, get kind of the bigger kind of sticks and stuff out. What it's also gonna do is, should water or rain come in, it's just gonna be under this layer and flow right underneath us, right? And keep us more dry. It's gonna keep us warmer, all this insulation that we're creating for ourselves. So you can see how vitally important it is to have a good pair of gloves.
This is also a good time to check. We haven't dug up any ants so far or any sort of other wildlife, especially insects. This is a really good opportunity to learn if this is a good site or not. Obviously at this point, if you had a lot of ants, you probably wouldn't want to build your shelter right here.
All right, and there we go. So it may not look very cushy, but honestly, it's a lot cushier than the ground. So there we go. All right, now we're gonna determine where we want to build the entrance to our shelter. So most likely, based on like the trees, we're probably gonna wanna build the entrance to our shelter on this side where Hobbes is at. The reason for that is we can kind of tell by how the trees are kind of curved a little bit this way of this terrain that the wind is typically coming this way, in this direction through this valley. So probably about where, like right in here, is around where we want to have our shelter entrance. Next, when building our shelter, we want to ensure that we're not going too big, too much. We might end up moving this roughage a little bit more down because definitely we don't need it to be this large. We may only need to come to about right here. So we might end up just moving all this down, but we're gonna kind of start at the bottom and work our way up. That way, if we don't need all this room up here, then we don't have to worry about it. So we'll start at the bottom, work our way up. We need to find all sorts of different types of sticks. What we're gonna do is find sticks like so to kind of start at the bottom. And what's gonna happen is we're going to point our sticks towards the support tree. So that way. So we wanna kind of layer them. We're gonna layer them this way. So. we have our structure built, we now need to think about if it rains or hails or snows or any like beating down sun, that we have all these gaps. And what that will do is create like a sieve structure, right? So we have our door, and we still want to leave our door free and clear, which is right here, but we still need to fill in all these gaps here. So we need to create something like shingles for our shelter. So good stuff like this. You can also use any type of like bark off of the tree if like there's laying around bark. Yeah, I've just got a nice piece right here. Things like this will create those like nice kind of closures for where we want to keep those gaps closed off. So any type of bark, things like that. We want to try and close it off. Sometimes if you can get like a good pile of roughage, you can also try and fill a few of the spots, especially like down under here, and kind of build it up from the bottom, like so. And then kind of keep going up and up and up, and kind of fill in those gaps there to create that shingle-like structure for our shelter. Because otherwise it's just gonna all go through here. I actually have, I happen to hike with a tarp.
That's
so
convenient.
I'm actually gonna grab my tarp, and I'm also gonna show you how we can use a tarp to help kind of cover in these holes. All right, so what you can do is grab your tarp. And you can overlay your tarp around your shelter. So you can kind of see what we're trying to go for here. You then would grab more large sticks and rebuild your structure up on top of here. So Hobbes, help me grab this guy right here. So you can again take more sticks and just rebuild on top of your structure. And that really closes off those gaps. In a jiffy, let's say you're not done with your structure and you're painting, you're like, oh my goodness, here comes a storm. It's like coming right over the ridge. What am I gonna do? My shelter isn't ready. If I get wet, I get cold, I could contract hypothermia. So I wanna make sure to have a real quick fix. So my really quick fix, it's not permanent, not land lasting, especially if I have to survive for a few days or weeks, right? But in a quick fix, what I can do, take my tarp, I'm gonna grab a nice big pine cone, maybe another big pine cone. How about this guy? You got one over there, Hobbes? Yeah, perfect. We'll go 3 pine cones. So we're gonna grab 3 pine cones. We're gonna find the middle of our tarp, which is roughly about here. Yep. I'm gonna create kind of like a little ball up top. Take my rope, tie it around. That should be good. Probably tie it off. I'm gonna create a double knot, just extra secure, like that. And then I'm probably gonna have to grab another stick. Maybe I'll just toss it over.
Here, this one's a good one.
Oh, that's really large. Maybe. Yeah. So I'm tall, but I'm not quite tall enough. Maybe. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You want to hold that up for me? There we go. Alright. And then, I'm gonna, what do you think, Hobbs, about maybe there?
I think so. That'll keep the feet in.
Okay. So I just did a little slip knot right there because that'll allow us to kind of bring it down a little bit if we need. And what Hobbs and I can do is just quickly either cover our shelter like so, or oh my gosh, Hobbs, get under. Here comes the storm. And we can quickly get under here in just a jiff and kind of keep ourselves nice and protected from the elements. So here's just a little lesson on shelter building. We hope that you are able to come to camp in the future and come build a shelter and finish it up for us. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.